It's a pleasure to be here. The title of my talk today is Hard Lessons: Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance, and the Quest for Sustainable Empire. And I'm recording this talk about a week and a half after the return of Taliban rule in Afghanistan, an event that has served as yet another painful indication of the utter failure of the global war on terror. The images from Afghanistan blazoned on our screens from global media outlets also offers a reminder of the enormous and agonizing cost borne by communities on the front lines of counterterrorism operations over the last 20 years. And the title of the talk, Hard Lessons, comes from a refrain that I encountered while conducting field work between 2014 and 2019 on security operations in the West African Sahel. And this descriptor was used by active duty and retired US military personnel and personnel working at various United Nations agencies who had previously worked in Afghanistan before coming to their posts in the West African Sahel. And the hard lessons were the purported regrets from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so in my talk, I want to reflect on the shadow cast by these conflicts and what it means for thinking about other regions impacted by the war on terror. So on November 1st, 2019, the United States Air Force announced the official opening of Air Base 201 in Agadez, Niger. The $110 million installation houses the second largest U.S. military presence on the African continent, after Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. Millions of dollars over budget and more than a year behind schedule, the construction of the site began in 2016 after the United States and Nigerian governments signed a 10-year lease agreement. An AFRICOM press release outlining the role of Air Base 201 explained, quote, "In support of our partner forces and international efforts to counter violent extremist organizations in the region, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations have begun out of Nigerian Air Base 201 in Agadez, Niger. United States Africa Command has an agreement with the government of Niger for use of armed and unarmed air assets in its airspace that improve our combined ability to respond to threats and other security issues in the region. These assets are used towards achieving the mutual goals of the United States and our West African partners," end quote. The base is home to Predator and Reaper drones, C-117 and C-130 cargo planes, and serves as a refueling station for U.S. aircrafts. And it accompanies a smaller neighboring drone base operated by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Situated in rural northern Niger, these sites were selected for their perceived geographic advantage in launching surveillance and security missions throughout North and West Africa. In a promotional video produced by Airman magazine documenting the opening of Air Base 201, Brigadier General Michael Rawls described the installation as, quote, "one of the most Herculean efforts in the history of the United States Air Force," end quote. And by way of emphasizing Rawls' words, the video cycles through wide aerial shots of rural Niger, cutting to a U.S. soldier in fatigue struggling to stand in a sandstorm, and then flashing to fistfuls of brown sand falling from unidentified white hands. Rawls further describes the construction of the base as a, quote, "seemingly impossible task conducted in one of the most austere, if not the most austere locations the United States Air Force has ever operated out of," end quote. Ultimately, as the video concludes, American military engineers and logistical ingenuity triumph over the landscape. This video joins a series of others produced by the Defense Visual Information Distribution Service and the Department of Defense. And a common thread links these videos as they emphasize the technical capacity of the US military to forge this infrastructural marvel in a seemingly empty, unforgiving landscape. They also trade in a kind of mediated transparency, inviting viewers behind the scenes of US security operations in the Sahel. And this move makes visible, curated aspects of those operations, even as the projects themselves work to obtain a totalizing vision of the region through their clandestine surveillance missions flown from this base. And the official opening of Airbase 201 occurred 2 years after the deaths of 4 members of a U.S. Army Special Forces team following an ambush in Tongo, Niger, which is near the Malian border. And according to media reports, the soldiers came under fire from fighters affiliated with the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. And these deaths mark the single largest number of American combat troop casualties in an African country since the disastrous intervention in Somalia in 1993. And during interviews I conducted with U.S. senior officials based in Niger at the time of the Tongo attack, they described the deaths of the U.S. soldiers as a watershed moment that illustrated the need for a robust U.S. security presence in the Sahel. They noted the lack of air cover and surveillance support that made the soldiers more vulnerable to attack. But these deaths also prompted questions about what a U.S. presence in the region should look like. Officials expressed concern that increased U.S. casualties would stymie domestic political support for American activities in the Sahel. A press release issued by the Department of Defense shortly after the 2017 attack framed the U.S.'s presence in the region as both a boon to Niger, but also imperative for regional security. The report explained, quote, "There are approximately 800 U.S. military personnel in Niger, which is about twice the size of Texas. This number includes personnel supporting the U.S. Embassy in Niamey, personnel supporting construction efforts at Airbase 201 in Agadez, and personnel stationed in the country for other temporary duties and operations. While U.S. Special Forces are advising and assisting the Nigerian armed forces, they make up a fraction of the overall U.S. force composition in Niger. Some of these forces are supporting French operations in the region. The French maintain over 4,000 troops there. Mostly, the U.S. provides refueling, intelligence support, and surveillance support," end quote. So Airbase 201 exists as a single node in a suite of U.S. military bases and installations across the globe, but it highlights the trajectory of contemporary security governance in the West African Sahel specifically. In 2002, immediately after the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks of the previous year, the U.S. government launched Operation Enduring Freedom, Trans-Sahara, and the Pan-Sahel Initiative, the first of what would become several counterterrorism operations in the region. And U.S. military presence in the Sahel has followed a pace from the presidencies of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and while the Biden administration has not formally outlined its policy towards the Sahel, it has thus far continued many of the counterterrorism activities of its predecessors. So while counterterrorism projects continue to orient much of this engagement with the Sahel in the present, security actors in the Sahel routinely advocate a light touch or light footprint approach, distinct from activities taking place in parts of East Africa and the Middle East. And this light touch foregrounds strategic monitoring and intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance missions. So thus, proponents of expanded American drone operations in Niger often tout Airbase 201 primarily for these ISR capabilities. Contemporary surveillance infrastructures emerged from a series of technological projects developed in the mid-20th century. So Cold War air defense systems laid the groundwork for contemporary aerial surveillance, and it asserted this U.S. military quest for total situational awareness, or a comprehensive surveillance of the entire globe through automated remote sensing, tracking, and response technologies. But still, it's important to note that the effects and strategies of these tools exceed the merely technical. They are, as geographer Derek Gregory explains, techno-cultural assemblages that simultaneously produce new forms of both distance and intimacy. So amid the predominance of drone usage over the last 2 decades, much has been written about how claims about the precision and accuracy of drones serves to expand the theaters of war making and authorizes an everywhere war. But still, if armed drone attacks have served as a way to theorize the parameters of empire in the present, I think attending to the forms of watchfulness and anticipation at work specifically in the Sahel offers an occasion to contemplate the specific but also contradictory place of surveillance as an imperial infrastructure. The language of watching continues to animate U.S. security policy across the region. And so in this context, ISR, with its reliance on aerial technology, provides a type of corrective to the failures of other theaters, namely in Iraq and Afghanistan. So in interviews I conducted, AFRICOM personnel stressed intelligence gathering and sharing role of the United States, drawing a marked contrast with France, which by that point had deployed several thousand troops across the Sahel. And their repeated invocation of the hard lessons learned in Afghanistan and Iraq betrayed an unwillingness of the US government to contribute large-scale military interventions across Africa. There was a presumed absurdity of an Afghanistan or Iraq-style war on the African continent for these informants, but that this still mandated other kinds of interventions. My informants stressed the need for alternate ways to advance security interests without the liabilities of combat troops. What was revealing, though, is that they still affirmed a requisite vigilance and a desire to remake but assure the continuation of US global militarism. So AFRICOM personnel portrayed Africa as a, quote, low-priority space with less importance than the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And they outlined the challenges of advancing global security on a tight budget. So operations in the Sahel offered a test case for managing a deeply US-American vision of a fundamentally insecure world without accruing the financial, political, and personnel cost of other wars. My informants insisted that the US was not like European Union countries, not interested in being, quote, on the front lines in Africa, end quote, but that the US government still wanted to influence the security trajectory there. Aerial technologies held a particular appeal. So robust networks of surveillance and military intelligence were on offer as providing security comparatively cheaply. And in this framing, while France had put boots on the ground in the Sahel, the US had taken the skies. And as such, the US government, and specifically AFRICOM security experts working on the Sahel, claimed for themselves a technical capacity that France lacked. And indeed, in January 2020, French President Emmanuel Macron requested the US remain in the Sahel because France would be unable to successfully maintain its security projects there without US support. So French policies have been made possible in part through a US-led surveillance apparatus and intelligence sharing arrangements. Now, with President Macron's decision in 2021 to draw down French troops in the Sahel, it remains to be seen how much of these intelligence sharing arrangements will be transferred over to the security services of local Sahelian governments. Still, in public statements, AFRICOM often portrays its policies across Africa as building local security capacity, as providing the tools to, quote, enable African solutions to African problems, end quote. But these African solutions are buttressed by US surveillance. The operations of local militaries depend on intelligence provided by the US in its role as knowledge producer and a steward of this kind of monitoring expertise. And the outsourcing of the most dangerous labor to others, namely the local security forces, facilitates a kind of light touch security as US agencies seek to remain in the position of watcher. The attendant watchfulness that orients light touch security is manifest discursively in press releases, policy briefings, while the material circumstances of an extensive surveillance network aspires to remain out of sight, cloistered within the realm of covert operations and classified intelligence reports. The insistence that Africans solve African problems is belied by the ways that US intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance activities shape the representations of certain kinds of threats. So the dual language of local ownership, coupled with the acknowledgement of ongoing US interests, leaves little room for the possible divergence of those things. This approach holds additional appeal as it is ostensibly unencumbered by accusations of more nefarious forms of foreign intervention. So my informants at AFRICOM, well aware of the critiques of US activities throughout Africa as a kind of neo-colonialism, routinely laughed off such assertions by referencing both the predominance of French troops in the region and contrasting this with what they saw as more benign American surveillance activities. Yet such surveillance activities are ultimately still backed by the deadly force of the US military. So ultimately, in my research, I find that ISR stands as both a tactic of security governance and a means for its disavowal. Throughout my interviews, explanations about the surveilling character of US military presence in the Sahel was meant to be reassuring, that it was merely ISR in contrast to more forceful interventions. Yet even as they positioned the US as mere spectator, my informants conveyed that its presence was essential to assure regional stability. In this way, the US was portrayed simultaneously as only there as needed, but also inevitably the final backer of security projects in the region. The US's role became one of knowledge production, of monitoring, of assuring that things don't get too bad. And this advisory and surveillance role was one that it could rightly claim for itself, given its expansive technological abilities in the area. So in conclusion, watching then allows a more circumscribed style of intervention before problems become too large. An American Green Beret based in Burkina Faso explained this to me as the importance of phase zero operations, which affirms sort of AFRICOM's investment in alternate measures of presumed success by asserting its presence in places where the worst effects of conflict have yet to materialize. The routine insistence about keeping an eye on things in the West African Sahel further discloses an imperial desire to observe everything, even or especially when that desire is unattainable. The drive to pursue a totalizing vantage, even as some places are derided as unimportant and not high on the list of political or economic interests, upholds the ability to see and to know what is happening in the Sahel as an unrelinquishable and indefinite project. The small, diffuse network of drone bases, surveillance projects, and intelligence gathering missions in many ways offer a more insidious expression of imperial power than the large-scale invasions and megabases of places like Iraq and Afghanistan, both because of their protracted and indefinite timescales and also because of their absented presence, the spatial distance that they cultivate. Thus, on the eve of the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Afghanistan, and as the hard lessons of that war continue to reverberate, we should remain attentive to the shifting nature of global security interventions, and also remain suspicious of attempts to rebuild and fortify a more sustainable version of empire. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.